science is not in principle committed to the idea that there's no afterlife, or that the mind is identical to the brain,
right,
or that materialism is true. Science is completely open to whatever in fact is true. Everything about your mind can be damaged by damaging the brain. You can cease to recognize faces, you can cease to know the names of animals, but you still know the names of tools. And what we're being asked to consider is that you damage one part of the brain and the mind, something about the mind and subjectivity is lost. You damage another and yet more is lost. And yet if you damage the whole thing at death, we can rise off the brain with all our faculties intact, recognizing grandma and speaking English.
So what gives rise to consciousness? Are we just matter, or there is something non-physical or immaterial about our mind that gives rise to consciousness? What does science say about it, and what can we learn from it that will help us in our own lives? In 1907, Dr. Duncan McDougall published a scientific study concluding that humans have a soul that is supposed to give rise to our consciousness, and it weighs about 21 grams. He took 6 dying patients and replaced their bed with an industrial-sized scale when they were just about to die. One of the patients showed a loss of 21 grams just after his death. Of course, this experiment was heavily criticized as a case of selective reporting. First of all, it had an extremely small sample size, and in that too, only one patient's result were taken as a conclusion. The other 5 patients were ignored as they did not show any significant loss in weight, and surprisingly, one of the patients lost some weight and then gained it back again. Dr. McDougall believed that only humans have soul, not animals. He repeated this experiment on 15 dogs. He poisoned 15 dogs and found no decrease in weight of dogs after death. Following the publication of the experiment in American Medicine, physician Augustus P. Clark criticized the experiment's validity. Clark noted that at the time of death, there is a sudden rise in body temperature as the lungs are no longer cooling the blood, causing a subsequent rise in sweating, which could easily account for McDougall's missing 21 grams. Clark also pointed out that as dogs do not have sweat glands, they would not lose weight in this manner after death. Physicist Robert L. Park has written that McDougall's experiments are not regarded today as having any scientific merit, and psychologist Bruce Hood wrote that because the weight loss was not replicable or reliable, his findings were unscientific. Pop culture was quick to pick up on the conclusion of the experiment and played a huge role in popularizing the myth of this 21-gram soul. However, now let's talk about this thing called soul, which Dr. Duncan McDougall believed in. He certainly believed that the soul that gives rise to consciousness is a physical object, as he was testing a physical property, weight. Now this physical soul can definitely not be matter, cause we would have detected its presence long ago as soon as it left the body, especially with the current modern technology. So if soul is a physical object, then it has to be in the form of pure energy. Sadly, we have a bad news for this pure energy soul. It's called the second law of thermodynamics. According to it, energy spontaneously disperses from being localized to becoming spread out if it is not hindered from doing so. So if we assume that such soul exists, as soon as this pure energy will leave the body, there will be no hindrance to stop it from being spreading out, and this energy will spread out across the entire universe and will be converted to unusable forms, like heat, and so it will no longer exist as a soul. But according to most definitions, souls are supposed to be immortal. Hence, it is a proof by contradiction that soul in the form of pure energy cannot exist. However, you might still wonder that we all have energy, and energy can neither be created nor destroyed. So where does this energy go after we die?
But when you die, where do you go? Isn't energy conserved? Don't you have energy in you? Doesn't it go somewhere? And the answer is that life is not an energy, a force, a spirit, a substance. It is a process. It is a chemical reaction. And the end of a life is putting out a candle. When you put out a candle, the energy doesn't go anywhere. The reaction stops. When you die, you don't go anywhere. Your atoms are still there. but you stop happening. That is what it means to die.
That pretty much sums up why a physical soul cannot exist. But what about a non-physical or immaterial soul or some other immaterial aspect of mind? It is the most popular concept of a soul. However, if you define a soul like this, then you also run into a problem. How does an immaterial soul interact with material or physical body? This is called the mind-body problem, and no one who believes in an immaterial soul has come up with a satisfactory solution to this problem. But let's ignore this problem for now, assuming that there might be some mechanism that we are still not aware of which connects the physical and the non-physical world. If you define something to be immaterial and put it out of the domain of science, it becomes difficult to test its validity. However, in this case also, science can help us. If we can somehow scientifically show that hypothesis of an immaterial soul is useless and the material world itself is sufficient to explain the consciousness, then there is no good reason to believe that something like an immaterial soul exists. First, let's address the elephant in the room, or should I say the elephant in the cranium, the brain. What is it that the humans do that the brain itself cannot explain, and some people think that there is a need to define something like an immaterial soul? Why can't consciousness be explained by the brain alone? Is it the personality we have, or the emotions we experience like happiness, love, compassion, etc.? Whatever it is, there must be something that physical brains can't do for which we will need the immaterial soul hypothesis. Otherwise, it will be a useless hypothesis. Recently, in last few decades, there has been a huge breakthrough in the field of neuroscience, and lots of things that was thought to be the result of the soul was found out to be the product of human brain. Even compassion has been found to be the product of physical brain.
There is the empirical question of there are 100 billion nerve cells in my brain, little wisps of jelly firing away. How does this activity of these cells give rise to the whole spectrum of abilities we call human nature, human consciousness? And I'd like to focus on a system of neurons called mirror neurons in the front of the brain. These neurons are called motor command neurons. They're a subcategory of motor command neurons. Motor command neurons are involved in orchestrating a sequence of muscle twitches to reach out and grab a cup. So there's one neuron or a small group of neurons in the frontal lobes, in the premotor cortex, that fires away when I reach out and grab a cup, orchestrating the sequence of muscle twitches. But it turns out that a small set of these neurons, identified in the last 10 years, will fire not only when I reach and grab a cup, but when I watch you reach out and grab a cup. This sounds astonishing, it sounds psychic, but it isn't. These neurons are called mirror neurons. So what's a mirror neuron doing? When I saw this paper, I jumped off my seat, because it's what the neuron is signaling to the higher areas in the brain is, the higher areas are saying, the same neuron is firing now as would fire when you reach and grab a cup. Therefore, that's what that person is intending to do. So it's a mind-reading neuron. It's a neuron that's creating a virtual reality simulation of another person's mind and empathizing with the other person, so to speak, which is the basis of compassion after all. So it allows you to look at the world from the other person's point of view.
Certain head injury leading to complete change in personality of a person.
Your nervous system makes you you. Let me tell you a story. The curious case of Phineas Gage. In 1848, a genial chap named Phineas Gage was working on the railroad, tamping gunpowder into a blasting hole with an iron rod when the gunpowder ignited. The resulting explosion caused the rod to shoot like a bullet up through his left cheek and out the top of his head. There's brain in between those two places, by the way. Amazingly, he stood up after the accident and walked over to a cart, described what had happened, and then they drove him back to his house, all while he was conscious. So the doctor came to examine him and refused to believe that a rod had in fact passed through his head. Understandably, until Phineas started coughing and an amount of brain that the doctor described as a teacupful fell out of his head. And the doctor had to accept, indeed, what had happened. After a few months of convalescing, he was pretty much healed up and moving around like he used to. But some of his friends were saying that Phineas was no longer himself. Yes, he had his memories and mental abilities, and he walked and talked and looked the same minus an eyeball, but whereas the old Phineas was mild-mannered and soft-spoken, the post-spike to the brain Phineas was surly and mean-spirited and vulgar. People started to describe him as no longer Gage.
or certain head injury causing persons inability to feel certain emotions.
There is one extraordinary syndrome called Capgras syndrome, which is so rare that even most neurologists have not heard of it. This refers to patients who are otherwise normal, sometimes in a psychiatric setting, but sometimes just after a head injury. The guy's been in a car accident and maybe has been in a coma for a couple of weeks and then comes out of the coma, seems quite normal, fluent in conversation, not emotionally disturbed, not hysterical in any obvious way, seems quite normal, except that he has one profound delusion. He looks at his mother and he says, "Doctor, this woman looks exactly like my mother." You know? He looks exactly, but she's not my mother. She's an imposter. She's pretending to be my mother. And then I thought maybe there's a simpler explanation for this syndrome, namely, we know that in the temporal lobes there's an area called infratemporal cortex, which is concerned with just processing faces, recognizing faces. When that's damaged, you get prosopagnosia, you can no longer recognize people's faces. But when you look at any object in the world, it's processed there, and then it gets sent to the amygdala and to the limbic system, which are the emotional centers of the brain, so you're emotionally aroused by what you're looking at. If it's a slide projector, obviously you're not emotionally aroused. If it's a light there, you're not aroused. But if you look at a mother, you say, "Wow, it's my mom." You know, there is this warm glow or this terror, as the case may be, okay? When you look at your mother. When you look at somebody else who you've never seen before, there is no emotional arousal. So what I said was, maybe what's wrong with this guy is, maybe the face area is normal. That's why he can still say, "Yeah, it looks like my mother. It looks like my mother." But the message doesn't get to the amygdala because this wire is cut because of the head injury. So he looks at his mother and he says, "If it's my mom, why don't I feel anything? There's something weird here. It must be some other strange woman." That's the only explanation that makes sense to him, given this disconnection I'm talking about.
And also brain injury leading to loss of memory. All this indicates that mind might just be the product of human brain. However, the believers of Immaterial Soul explain it like this. They say that the brain acts as a window to the world for the immaterial soul. If certain parts of the brain get damaged, the soul can't access that part of the brain. Now this explanation can be countered in a lot of ways, but here is one of the strongest counter arguments supported by an experiment. It's called V.S. Ramachandran's split brain experiment.
One group of patients we have studied is split brain patients or commissurotomy patients. These are people whose corpus callosum has been cut, and anterior commissure and massa intermedia whenever encountered. So essentially you're doing a karate chop right through the head and creating two human beings in one body, in one skull, two spheres of consciousness. Now, many experiments have been done on these people, and I asked myself a very simple question. Okay, you've created two people here. What about their personalities? Do they have different personalities? What about their aesthetic preferences? Does one like blondes and the other like brunettes, for example? One like chocolate and the other like vanilla? What happens? So we tried these experiments, and what we did was we had to first train the right hemisphere to communicate with us. In fact, the right hemisphere can read simple commands, simple words, simple sentences, and then you ask a question and say, point to a box, yes, no, I don't know, because it can't talk. The right hemisphere cannot talk, but it can comprehend simple semantics, simple questions. Left hemisphere, of course, can talk, so you can present boxes, yes, no, I don't know. So we asked, for example, are you at Caltech? And the right hemisphere pointed to yes. Are you on the moon? It said no. Okay, so now comes the big question. What if you ask, do you believe in God? So I said, do you believe in God? And the right hemisphere went straight to yes, right? I asked the same question to the left hemisphere, yes, no, I don't know. It went to no, right? So here's a human being whose right hemisphere is an atheist, and left hemisphere, on the other hand, believes in God. And this finding should have sent a tsunami through the theological community, but barely produced a ripple, because it raises all kinds of profound theological questions. If this person dies, what happens? Does one hemisphere go to heaven and the other go to hell? I don't know the answer to that.
In this experiment, V.S. Ramachandran studied split brain patients whose two hemispheres of the brain has been split, which gives rise to two independent centers of consciousness. The left and the right brain behaves as two independent people in one body with different personalities and beliefs. Definitely, an immaterial soul cannot be split physically. At most, you can say that the immaterial soul has taken shelter in one of the hemisphere, but that just means the other hemisphere is able to have personality, beliefs, and all the other features attributed to the soul without a soul. Now this proves that brain can give rise to these features without an immaterial soul, making soul a completely unnecessary hypothesis. So does that mean that the physical brain is the only thing responsible for consciousness and there is no other immaterial aspect to it? Well, that's most likely the conclusion according to the science.
With the development of psychology and neuroscience, scientists have weighed in as well. Many modern scientists reject the idea that there's any distinction between the mind and body. Neuroscience suggests that our bodies, along with their physical senses, are deeply integrated with the activity in our brains to form what we call consciousness. From the day we're born, our mental development is formed through our body's interaction with the external world. Every sight, sound, and touch create new maps and representations in the brain that eventually become responsible for regulating our experience of self.
There has been certain objections to the idea that consciousness is only the result of the brain. The molecules and atoms in our body gets replaced over time. So if we are just physical matter, then how do we remain the same person? The cells in the tip of our finger also gets replaced over time, but the fingerprint itself doesn't change. So is the fingerprint also some immaterial thing? Of course not. The key here is the arrangement of matter. We are not matter, we are certain arrangement of matter with energy in the form of nerve impulses flowing through it in certain way. It can also be stated that we or our consciousness is not matter but a process that is being carried out by physical matter. Consciousness is not a noun but a verb. This allows us to answer some of the other important objections to the brain being only the center of consciousness. Like how can unconscious matter give rise to consciousness? As already stated, consciousness is not matter, but the product of process carried out by these matter arranged in certain way. When these processes stops, the consciousness ceases to exist and we call it death. Consciousness is an emergent property of neurons, just like wetness is an emergent property of water. Each neuron is not conscious, just like one single molecule of water is not wet. Also, at certain number of molecules of water, the property of wetness emerges. Similarly, at certain number of neurons, the property of consciousness emerges. Hence, we can say that the minds are what the brains do. Now, thinking that mind cannot give rise to consciousness alone and we need something else to explain it is kind of an insult to the supercomputer sitting on the top of your head. With 100 billion neurons, the brain is capable of extremely powerful processing. Humans invented the concept of the soul when they had no idea about the capability and power of the brain. Many people are just reluctant to the idea that we are just made up of material stuff. The thing is, people feel that consciousness being a product of physical processes somehow undermines our existence. But in fact, it makes our consciousness and its components like emotions and feelings more real. If you believe that there is an immaterial soul, then letting go of the belief will not somehow make you less emotional or less conscious, but will make you more aware of the reality. And your ideas of the human consciousness will be based on something much more solid called science.
Can you still love people while viewing them as part of this vast fabric of causality? And I find that there is no sacrifice to the good stuff. I mean, it's not, first of all, things have to be sort of situationally appropriate. I'm not constantly looking at my daughter thinking about she's just a part of the physical universe and wow, neurotransmitters giving rise to all this cuteness. I mean, that's not the mode I'm in, but even to think in those terms, it doesn't cancel the desire for her happiness. It doesn't the love survives the truth. It doesn't love is not vulnerable to knowing how things are arising. And knowing how things are arising doesn't nullify all the distinctions about the differences, the possible differences in human experience that we care about. We still care about living good, happy, easy, positive lives. And what else could we care about?
Consciousness, emotions, feelings, happiness, love, everything is still real. It's just that the nature of reality is not what you thought it to be. In fact, this understanding makes all of these even more real by making them scientifically verifiable along with being subjectively perceivable. But what do we learn from this? That one day you will die, and most likely that will be the ultimate end of your consciousness. There is no component in the brain that will allow the survival of your consciousness after your death. Does this make you scared that one day you will no longer exist? Well, you did not exist from the time of the beginning of the universe up until your birth. If that does not bother you, then why not existing after your death up until the death of the universe does? The existence of your consciousness will be for a very short period of time, and that's what makes it more valuable. You will not live forever. Rather, you will live for a very short period of time compared to the age of the universe. And this idea makes your each second more valuable and too precious to waste. One more thing that we learned is that if our mind and consciousness is what the brain does, then this 3-pound fatty sponge in our head is who we are, and we need to take utmost care of it. Get proper sleep, get proper nutrients, meditate, do everything to prevent it from any kind of damage. Lastly, we learn to acknowledge mental conditions and mental illness in a proper way. Since physical brain is all that is, and there is no magical immaterial component to it, these conditions are the result of physical and chemical changes in our brains and requires proper treatment or therapy. For example, depression is caused by actual chemical changes in the brain. So you cannot think the depression away.
If I had to define major depression in one sentence, I would say it's a biochemical disorder with a genetic component and early experience influences where somebody can't appreciate sunsets. And that's what this disease is about.
And saying people with depression that it's all in your head is like shooting someone in the legs and saying it's all in your legs. And also, it is nothing to be ashamed of, and people should be open-minded about it, like any physical illness. When someone's legs get fractured, we don't think that he is so weak, he broke his legs. Neither the person hides it to prevent judgment from the society. Sadly, due to lack of understanding and vague ideas about our consciousness and the brain, people can't acknowledge mental conditions in the same way. What are your thoughts about consciousness? Did you always believe that it is the product of the brain, or you believed in an immaterial soul? Was I able to change your mind, or do you have a better argument for the existence of a soul? Let me know in the comments and let it evolve into a discussion.